My name is Daisy Jimenez, and I'm 31 years old. Growing up as the youngest Jimenez child meant growing up in the shadow of my brother Carlos's light, or at least the light everyone swore he had. Carlos was the family's golden boy captain of the baseball team homecoming king, and later the kind of businessman my parents boasted about at dinner parties. I was the quiet one, the girl who took apart radios instead of dolls, who could spend hours staring at circuit diagrams like they were poetry. When I was 10, I asked my father how electricity actually moved through a wire. He chuckled, patted my head, and said, "Ask your teachers, sweetheart. I sell cars, not dreams." Then he went back to watching Carlos practice his swing in the yard. "That's how it always was," Carlos performed. I questioned. Carlos won trophies. I broke things apart to understand how they worked. Mom would sigh when she found me surrounded by wires and tools on the kitchen table. "Daisy, darling, can't you do something normal for once? Carlos never made such a mess." I stopped explaining that I wasn't making a mess, I was building a transmitter, but nobody ever wanted to hear why. By the time Carlos graduated high school with a scholarship to a top business program, the entire extended family called him the Pride. I remember overhearing Aunt Lucia once say, "Daisy's clever, but Carlos, he's going places." That phrase stuck to me for years, going places. It was as if intelligence only mattered when it wore a suit and shook hands. I graduated 2 years after Carlos with the highest GPA in our school's history and a full scholarship to MIT. My mother smiled politely during dinner, then turned to Carlos to ask about his first promotion. My father raised a toast not to me, but to having 2 successful children. Except only one of us counted as successful. It's strange how early you learn your role in a family. Mine was to be invisible but reliable, the girl who never caused trouble, the one who didn't demand attention, the one who would be fine on her own. So I learned to be fine. I poured my loneliness into equations, my jealousy into design projects, my longing for approval into late-night experiments. While Carlos climbed ladders in shiny offices, I climbed academic steps lined with chemical burns and coffee stains. When I started my PhD in material science, Dad asked if I was still studying. The way he said still made it sound like an illness I refused to recover from. "Someone's got to invent the future," I said lightly. He laughed, half proud, half confused. "Just make sure that future pays the bills, huh?" That became our running joke, except it wasn't funny. By 26, I had published award-winning papers, contributed to patents, and lectured at conferences filled with people twice my age. Yet at every family gathering, I was the sister who never left school. Carlos would talk about quarterly goals and sales projections. Everyone listened as though he were unveiling scripture. When I mentioned developing conductive polymer networks, the room filled with polite silence, the kind reserved for topics no one cares to understand. One Thanksgiving, I overheard Mom telling her friend Daisy's doing something with computers or science, I think. "She loves it, bless her heart." The tone she used was the same one people reserve for talking about a neighbor's odd hobby. I smiled, refilled her wine glass, and said nothing. You learn not to expect applause when your audience doesn't know what they're watching. But that silence, the constant humming silence, became my drive. It was like static in the back of my mind. I wanted to be heard not by shouting, but by creating something so undeniable they'd have no choice but to listen. I started spending more nights at the lab than at home. The hum of equipment became more familiar than my own voice. My colleagues, Sarah and James, became the closest thing I had to family. We joked about living off caffeine and curiosity, but I knew I wasn't joking. This was my language. Circuits, conductivity materials, transformation. These were my words. At night, when everyone left, I'd sit alone under the blue glow of the instruments and imagine current running through the thin filaments of my work, connecting atoms, creating something alive out of lifeless matter. Sometimes it felt like a reflection of my own longing to connect, to be seen. Once Sarah caught me staring at a half-assembled module and asked, "What are you thinking about conductivity?" I said. "How even a tiny resistance can stop a perfect connection." She smiled. Talking about the project or your family, I laughed it off, but she wasn't wrong. Still, I loved them. My family. Even in their blindness, I loved them. I told myself they weren't cruel, just limited. They couldn't see what I saw. But love without recognition is like running electricity through air. It sparks, then disappears. So I kept working. I didn't chase their approval anymore. I chased data, results, discovery. When my first independent paper was published in Nature Materials, I emailed my parents the link. Mom replied, "That's wonderful, honey. Will they pay you for that?" I stared at her message for a long time, then just typed, No, Mom, not yet. That yet carried the weight of every unspoken promise I'd ever made to myself. Someday I told myself I'll create something they can't ignore. Something that will make even Carlos pause mid-sentence. Something that will make my father proud, not out of obligation, but out of awe. I didn't know what that something would be yet, only that it would come. And when it did, it would change everything. The older I grew, the smaller I felt at family dinners. Carlos's voice always filled the room, smooth, confident, threaded with self-assurance. Only people who've never been doubted possess. Mine, when I tried to speak, felt like static in the background. He'd talk about sales figures, quarterly targets, leadership retreats. I'd mention my latest research on molecular conductivity and watch eyes glaze over faster than condensation on a wine glass. One night, Mom interrupted me mid-sentence to ask Carlos if he wanted more potatoes. That's when I learned silence isn't just an absence of sound, it's a verdict. The family hierarchy was clear. Carlos impressed the world. I confused it. After finishing my PhD, I joined Stanford's Advanced Materials Research Institute, my dream job. Our lab specialized in flexible electronics, trying to make devices that could bend and stretch without losing performance. The kind of thing that could transform technology forever. But when I shared that news, Mom said, "That's nice, sweetheart. Still at that university, right? Maybe someday you'll work for one of those real companies like Carlos." A real company. It hurt, but I laughed because laughing was easier than explaining quantum tunneling effects to people who barely understood Wi-Fi. Still, I kept inviting them into my world. Each time they stepped around it politely, like tourists avoiding puddles. There was one dinner I'll never forget. I'd just presented a breakthrough paper at a global engineering symposium in Zurich. Weeks of preparation, months of experiments, and I came home glowing with pride. That night, Carlos announced he'd been promoted to regional sales director. Dad opened champagne before I could even finish telling them where Zurich was. Mom raised her glass and said, "To Carlos, our rock star." Then she turned to me and added, "And to Daisy, who's, doing her science." Laughter followed, mine included. It was easier that way. Later in my childhood room, still decorated with pastel walls and a framed high school diploma, I looked at my old circuit boards. They seemed ancient now, relics from a girl who still thought effort could earn attention. That night I wrote in my journal, "Some of us build empires from confidence. Others build from rejection. Both can stand tall, but only one remembers why it started." I started working longer hours after that. The lab became my refuge. The smell of solder, the hum of machines. It all felt safer than the noise of a house that only cheered for one child. Sarah, my research partner, noticed the shift. "You ever rest, Daisy?" she asked one night as we logged data past midnight. "I rest when the world listens," I said, eyes fixed on the microscope. She chuckled. "Then you'll never sleep." I know. My breakthrough came not in a eureka moment, but in thousands of small corrections, mistakes so minor, they'd drive most people insane. But every failure felt like a message from the universe: keep going. It was around that time I realized the pattern. The same perseverance that made me invisible to my family made me unstoppable in research. The world didn't reward loudness, it rewarded endurance. Then came the email. A colleague from Tokyo wrote, "Dr. Jimenez, your work on conductive polymer networks is extraordinary. I believe you're close to achieving something revolutionary." That word revolutionary stopped me cold. It wasn't the first time someone had praised my research, but this was different. It wasn't pity or politeness. It was recognition. Still, I didn't tell my family. What was the point? To them, research was a phase, an elaborate hobby that had gone on too long. One Sunday, Dad asked, "When are you going to start something practical, like a business?" "I'm developing materials that could make electric vehicles run for months without charging," I said. He laughed, thinking it was a joke. So never then. Mom smiled apologetically. "You know your father, Daisy. He just worries. He wants you to be secure." "I am secure," I said. "In a lab?" she asked. "Alone." That word alone stung, because she was right, but not in the way she thought. I wasn't alone because I loved my work. I was alone because I'd stopped trying to fit into their version of love. When my first patent application was filed, a small one, nothing world-changing, I almost sent them the documents. Then I imagined Dad asking, "So how much is that worth?" and deleted the draft. Carlos called once that month. "Hey, Lenny, Mom said you're still doing the science thing." "Yes." He laughed. "You must really love that stuff. I'd die without talking to people all day." "You'd die in my lab within 5 minutes," I said, smiling. He laughed louder. "Fair. Anyway, we're hosting Christmas at my place. Come see what a real job can buy. He said it jokingly, but it landed with weight. Everything Carlos said carried that mix of affection and condescension. He didn't mean to hurt me. That made it worse. I stared at my reflection in the lab's glass door after the call. The fluorescent lights blurred against the dark outside like stars behind fog. Real job. Maybe he was right in their eyes. Maybe my job wasn't real because my value wasn't measured in bonuses or promotions. But as I returned to my bench, the data on the screen glowed a perfect curve, elegant and promising. For the first time in months, my pulse raced. We were close. Something in the polymer alignment pattern was different, more stable. Sarah leaned over my shoulder, squinting at the monitor. Is that... Not yet, I said, holding my breath. But soon. I didn't know it then, but soon would mean everything. Because in a matter of weeks, I'd make a discovery that would turn that same word real into something my family could finally understand. Only by the time they did, it would be too late to undo the years of silence they'd built between us. It happened on a Tuesday night, one of those long, sleepless ones, when the world outside feels paused. The lab was quiet except for the low hum of the spectrometer. Blue monitor light spilled across the floor like moonlight through glass. Sarah was asleep on her desk, a blanket draped over her shoulders. I was still running conductivity tests, chasing numbers that had refused to stabilize for months. Then, at 2:17 a.m., the resistance reading dropped. Not slightly, completely. I blinked, thinking it was a calibration error. I reran the test. Same result. I swapped the sample-adjusted temperature pressure, ambient humidity. The reading held steady. "Sarah," I whispered, shaking her awake. "Sarah, look." She groaned, rubbing her eyes. "What?" "Look at the data." Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief as she leaned closer. "No way. That's room temperature superconductivity," I said, my voice trembling. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stared at the screen, the line flat at zero, resistance unwavering. It was the kind of result that defied physics textbooks, the kind that made careers, or rewrote them. Then Sarah started laughing, that wild, disbelieving kind of laughter that sounds like crying. "You did it, Daisy." "We did it," I corrected automatically, though we both knew what this meant for me. I sank into my chair, staring at the graphs. Every sleepless night, every missed holiday, every awkward family dinner, all of it compressed into that one number 0. Zero resistance. It was perfect symmetry. By morning, our lead supervisor had called the department head. Within 48 hours, Stanford's Advanced Materials Division had quietly pulled us from all other projects. The discovery had to be verified, contained, protected. Patent teams were assembled, NDAs, signed, external communication frozen. It felt less like academia and more like the early stages of a secret military project. I was still half in disbelief when the university assigned me a patent lawyer, Dr. Rebecca Chin. She walked into my office carrying a leather portfolio and an energy that instantly filled the room. "Dr. Jimenez," she said, shaking my hand. "Before we even start, I need you to understand what you've done. This isn't a small innovation. It's a paradigm shift." I tried to laugh it off. "We just figured out how to make superconductivity practical." She smiled. "You just figured out how to make energy loss obsolete. That's the difference between a discovery and a revolution." Rebecca was sharp, methodical, and unlike most people, she didn't treat me like a curiosity. She treated me like a person who had changed the game. During our first strategy meeting, she leaned forward and said, "If the preliminary market analyses are right, Daisy, we're not talking millions. We're talking billions. Multiple." The word made my brain stutter. Billions. Every tech and energy company on Earth will want this. Phones that never need charging, electric vehicles with infinite range, computers that run faster than the human mind can think. Whoever owns this patent will control the future. It should have felt thrilling. Instead, I felt numb. Because the first thought that came to my mind wasn't about money or recognition, it was about silence. About how even if I told my family right now, they wouldn't understand a word of it. They'd smile politely, ask if it meant I finally had a real job. And Carlos would crack some joke about finally making something useful. So I didn't tell them. For 14 months, the patent process consumed my life. Technical reviews, peer evaluations, legal filings, endless revisions. The lab became my world, a windowless sanctuary where the future was being built one molecule at a time. Outside, life went on without me. Carlos got engaged. Mom sent me a group photo of the family celebrating, everyone dressed in champagne tones under fairy lights. Her caption read, Wish you were here. I was but in a different universe. One night, Sarah found me staring at that photo on my phone. You could have gone, she said softly. I couldn't, I replied. They wouldn't see me anyway. She didn't argue. She knew. The truth is, I'd stopped being angry years ago. What I felt now was quieter, like an old scar that still ached when it rained. The work gave me purpose, and purpose gave me distance. But distance has a cost. I started forgetting birthdays, missing calls. When Mom left me a voicemail, Honey, it's been so long, are you eating? I saved it just to hear her voice sometimes. Then came the day Rebecca called me out of the blue. Daisy, are you sitting down? Should I be? Yes, she said, her tone a strange mix of calm and excitement. The final approval came through. The United States Patent and Trademark Office has officially recognized your design for flexible superconductive substrates. You're the sole inventor and claimant. Congratulations, Dr. Jimenez. You just changed everything. I pressed my fingers against my temple. Rebecca, how much is it actually worth? She exhaled. Right now. We can't even estimate it properly. Early projections suggest a market potential in the tens of billions. Licensing alone could make you one of the wealthiest researchers alive. The words barely registered. I looked out the window of my office, past the lab buildings, past the parking lot, and all I could think of was my parents' dining room. The heavy oak table, the laughter, Carlos's confident voice filling the space. Still playing with wires, he'd said. And suddenly I knew what I wanted. Not revenge, not gloating. Just a moment, a single moment where the static stopped, where they saw me clearly. So I stayed silent. I didn't send the news, didn't forward the patent, didn't even hint at it when Mom called to ask what I wanted for Christmas. Just dinner with everyone, I said. I already knew it would be Carlos's engagement celebration too. I knew there'd be laughter toasts and subtle reminders that success to them wore cufflinks and a confident grin. I'd been invisible at every family table before, but this time I'd walk in holding something they could finally recognize, something that couldn't be ignored, mocked, or dismissed, something worth billions born from years of silence, and they'd never see it coming. Carlos's engagement dinner was everything my mother had ever dreamed of, a golden spectacle disguised as a family gathering. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables, covered in linen and laughter. Every cousin, aunt, and distant relative was there dressed like they were auditioning for a magazine spread. Carlos moved through the crowd with a champagne glass in hand, shaking hands, flashing smiles, calling everyone by name. He was effortless, magnetic. I stood near the window, sipping water from a flute because I didn't trust my hands not to shake. Mom found me within minutes. Daisy. You made it, sweetheart, she said, her perfume arriving before her hug. You look lovely, simple but elegant. I smiled politely. Hi, Mom. She leaned in and whispered, Try to relax a little, okay? Don't overthink everything tonight. Just enjoy your brother's moment. I wanted to tell her I wasn't overthinking. I was over-remembering. Remembering every dinner where she'd said those same words. Every moment where Carlos's moment had been the only one that mattered. Instead, I just said, Of course, Mom. I'm happy for him. The thing about family dynamics is they don't fade with age. They calcify. Everyone falls back into their old roles as easily as slipping into old clothes. Carlos was the star. Mom was the narrator. Dad was the audience. And I was the background music no one listened to. Halfway through dinner, Carlos stood to make a toast. His fiancée, Gabriella, glowing in gold, smiled at him like she'd never met a more perfect man. To family, he said, raising his glass. To love hard work and well knowing how to close a deal. Laughter rippled across the table. He went on about perseverance, about believing in yourself even when others doubt you. People nodded, clapped, beamed. The irony was almost poetic. When he finally sat down, Aunt Rosa turned to me. And what about you, Daisy? Still doing that science thing? I set my glass down. Yes, I've been leading a research team for the last few years. That's nice, she said sweetly. Any chance you'll ever get a real job? The words landed like an echo from my childhood. A real job. The one phrase that had followed me through every stage of my life like a mosquito I couldn't swat away. Before I could answer, Carlos laughed and said, Come on, Aunt Rosa, be nice. Daisy's saving the world one test tube at a time. Everyone chuckled. Even Mom smiled, though she added softly, You know your brother's just teasing. I smiled back. I know. He's been teasing me my whole life. Dad leaned forward. So what exactly do you do these days, honey? I researched new materials, I said evenly. Conductive systems that could change how electronics work. Carlos raised his glass again. Hear that, my little sister's mixing wires while the rest of us are making deals. Laughter again, the same kind that used to sting when I was a kid, half amused, half patronizing. It didn't hurt this time, not the same way, because now I knew something they didn't. I looked around the room, the family that had never once asked what I dreamed of, only what I'd achieved. They believed success had to be loud. That power had to wear a suit. They had no idea I was sitting on something that would make their world spin differently. Literally. As the laughter died down, I leaned toward my mother and whispered, "How's Dad's blood pressure?" She blinked, surprised. "Fine, why?" "No reason," I said, hiding my smirk. "Just wondering how he handles shocks these days." She gave me a puzzled look, then turned back to listen to Carlos's next story. Something about his new corner office with a view of downtown San Francisco. It was strange. The more he talked, the calmer I felt. Because I finally saw the truth with perfect clarity, their approval had never been about love. It was about status, recognition, narrative. Carlos made them feel proud because the world applauded him. And I, quiet, analytical, inconveniently complex, I reminded them of all the things they didn't understand. That realization didn't break me, it freed me. I sat there listening to them celebrate and silently counted down the days. 14. That's how long it would take for the patent office to finish the final verification process. 14 days until everything I'd worked for became official, public, undeniable, and irreversible. I thought about telling them that night, watching the laughter freeze midair, the forks pause halfway to mouths. But no, this wasn't the moment. They'd forget it by dessert. The moment had to be perfect. A few hours later, when the night wound down and people started saying goodbyes, Carlos came over and hugged me. "You okay, sis? You've been quiet all night." "Just tired," I said. "It's been a long week," he smiled. "Still working yourself to death, huh? You should get out more. Life's too short for microscopes and lab coats." I looked him straight in the eye. "You're right, Carlos. But sometimes the people who work in silence build things that outlive everyone else's noise." He laughed, thinking I was joking. I smiled back. "Congratulations on your engagement." Then I left, slipping out into the cold December night, where my reflection in the car window didn't look small anymore. It looked steady. The sky was clear, the stars faint but visible. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I whispered to myself as I drove away 13 more days. And for the first time, the number didn't sound like waiting. It sounded like destiny warming up its engines. 13 days later, I sat alone in my office, surrounded by empty coffee cups and scribbled equations, trying to convince myself I hadn't imagined it all. Patent review processes are slow, methodical, ruthless. Even with Stanford's backing, even with Rebecca's relentless follow-ups, there was always the risk of rejection or worse, delay. That morning, I'd come in early, running on 2 hours of sleep and too much caffeine. The winter light outside was thin and colorless, the kind that makes the world look half erased. I stared at my phone for hours, waiting for it to ring, pretending I wasn't. At 10:42 a.m., it finally did. "Dr. Jimenez." The voice was crisp, professional. "This is Patricia Williams from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I'm calling with excellent news regarding application US 22312478991A1. My throat went dry. I forced my voice to stay calm. "I'm listening. I'm pleased to inform you that your patent for flexible room temperature superconducting substrates has been approved with full international claims protection." Congratulations, Dr. Jimenez. This is one of the most significant technological breakthroughs we've processed in the past decade. The room spun. My pen rolled off the desk and clattered on the floor. "Approved," I said softly, as if saying it aloud would make it real. "Yes, the publication will go live next week. You should also be aware industry interest has already begun. We've received preliminary licensing inquiries from multiple corporations: Apple, Google, Samsung, Tesla." Patricia paused, her tone shifting from formal to awed. "Based on early estimates, the commercial value could exceed $5 billion in the first year alone." $5 billion. The number felt unreal, like a foreign language I was only beginning to understand. "Could you repeat that?" I whispered. $5 billion, she said again, gently, as if not to startle me. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there in silence. For 10 full minutes, I didn't move. My reflection in the glass window looked like someone else's, a woman on the verge of rewriting not just science, but her entire existence. Then Rebecca called. "Daisy," she shouted, before I could even say hello. "You did it. I'm already hearing from corporate legal teams. Google's trying to set up an emergency licensing meeting. Apple's VP of Innovation personally requested your contact. Rebecca, I said faintly. What do I even say to them? She laughed. You say nothing until I finish negotiating. But if you want a preview, they're talking about joint offers in the range of 5 to 6 billion each. Each. It was too much to process, so I didn't. I just stared at the faint lines on my palms, thinking absurdly that this was the same hand that had once soldered wires in a garage while my father told me to do something useful. I should have felt victorious, triumphant, but instead all I felt was calm. Not peace, more like a heavy stillness, because I knew what came next. There was another family dinner tonight. Carlos had organized it at our parents' house to celebrate his latest promotion, Vice President of West Coast Sales, the youngest VP in company history, according to Mom's group chat updates. It was poetic in a cruel way. His big moment landing on the same day mine became official. Rebecca must have heard the hesitation in my silence. Daisy, she said, don't tell them yet if you're not ready. We can handle this quietly. I exhaled slowly. No, I think it's time. By 6 o'clock, I was driving toward my parents' house with a bottle of Carlos's favorite wine in the passenger seat and a storm in my chest. Mom greeted me at the door, glowing with excitement. Daisy. You're right on time. Carlos is going to make his big announcement after dinner. Isn't it wonderful? I smiled. It's perfect timing, actually. The house was packed again. Same faces, same laughter, same hierarchy. Carlos sat at the head of the table like a corporate monarch holding court. As always, I took my quiet seat near the end. Dinner started with toasts and humble brags, punctuated by the clinking of cutlery and the sound of Carlos's polished voice describing his corner office and stock options. Mom clasped her hands like she was watching a movie about her own success. I always knew you'd make it, mijo. You just have that leadership spark. Carlos smiled, soaking in the praise. Takes focus, ambition, and knowing what really matters in business, he said, glancing at me with a smirk. Not everyone's built for that world. The chuckles that followed were soft but sharp, like little knives disguised as laughter. I smiled back. You're right, Carlos. Not everyone's built for that world. Then my phone buzzed. Patricia Williams again. I felt my pulse quicken. I glanced at the caller ID, then at Carlos. Excuse me, I said, standing up. This might be important. He rolled his eyes. Your lab homework can't wait until dessert. No, I said calmly. It can't. I walked into the kitchen and answered the call. Dr. Jimenez, Patricia said, her tone breathless. Now, I hope I'm not disturbing your evening, but I wanted to inform you that Google, Apple, and Microsoft have just submitted a joint licensing offer for your patent, $5.2 billion for exclusive rights. They're requesting an immediate response. I froze. For a second, all I could hear was the muffled sound of my family laughing in the next room. Could you repeat that $5.2 billion, Dr. Jimenez, with the potential for more if the secondary manufacturing clauses are approved? My heart pounded. My lips curled into something halfway between a smile and disbelief. Patricia, I said, can you hold for a moment? Of course. I stepped back into the dining room holding my phone. Sorry to interrupt, I said lightly, but I just got a call from the patent office. Patricia. Could you repeat what you told me? I'd like my family to hear this. The room fell silent. Patricia's voice carried clearly through the speaker. Certainly, Dr. Jimenez. I was just informing you that tech giants Google, Apple, and Microsoft have submitted a joint licensing offer of $5.2 billion for exclusive manufacturing rights to your superconducting substrate technology. They're calling it the most significant breakthrough in materials science in 50 years. The silence that followed was unlike any I'd ever heard before. Carlos's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Mom's fork froze midair. Dad stared at me like I'd just spoken in a different language. 5 billion, Aunt Rosa whispered. With a B, Patricia confirmed through the phone. Carlos finally found his voice. Daisy, what is this? Some kind of joke. No joke, I said, taking my phone off speaker. Patricia, I'll review the offers and call you back in the morning. Of course, Dr. Jimenez. Congratulations again. The world is already buzzing about your discovery. I ended the call and looked around the table. For the first time in my life, every eye in that room was on me. And not with polite pity, not with confusion, with awe. Mom's lips parted, her voice barely a whisper. Your little science projects. Apparently I said they were useful after all. Carlos set down his wine glass. His knuckles were white. Daisy, he said quietly. What did you just do? I smiled. I didn't do anything, Carlos. I just finished what I started years ago. No one spoke. The air felt thick, electrified. In the silence that followed, I realized something that made my heart ache and swell all at once. I hadn't just changed my family's perception of me. I'd changed the balance of power in the room. And I'd done it without raising my voice once. The air in that dining room felt different, heavier, thicker. It was as if oxygen itself had decided to stand still. No one moved. Not even the children who sensed something extraordinary had just cracked through the adult world like lightning. My mother was the first to speak. "Daisy, sweetheart." She blinked rapidly, her voice trembling. "Did that woman just say 5 billion with a B?" I said softly. "Though I hear Samsung and Tesla are preparing counteroffers. We'll see where it goes." My father sat back, his hand trembling against his glass. For once, the man who always had an answer, an opinion. A story about Carlos had nothing to say. Carlos finally spoke, his voice uneven. "You're saying companies like Apple and Google want to buy something you made license," I corrected. "They're bidding for exclusive manufacturing rights. It's not just mine, it's humanity's next step in energy and computing. But yes, I made it." There it was. That last line hung in the air like thunder after a flash. Carlos laughed short and sharp, the sound of disbelief trying to disguise fear. "You're serious, completely." He looked around as if expecting someone else to confirm it wasn't real. "You're telling me that my sister, the one who played with wires in the garage, is about to make more money than half the Fortune 500? I tilted my head. "I guess that depends on whether they all bid at once." Uncle Roberto let out a low whistle. "Dios mío." Silence. Then a nervous laugh. Then another. But this time no one was laughing at me. Mom's voice was unsteady when she spoke again. I think we owe you an apology for what I asked, genuinely curious, for not understanding how important your work was," she said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "We just thought you were experimenting." I said evenly. "That's how discovery works." Carlos's fiancée, Gabriela, blinked rapidly, trying to piece it together. "Wait, so you're rich now?" I smiled faintly. "Not yet, but the idea is." The word idea landed heavier than I expected. All my life I'd been told my ideas were impractical. Now they were worth billions. Carlos stared at his plate, his jaw tight. "Daisy, you could have told us." "I tried," I said, "for years. But you all heard noise when I spoke about what mattered to me, so I stopped speaking." No one dared to argue. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, slicing through the silence like a metronome, marking a new rhythm for our family. Then my phone buzzed again. I didn't even check the screen. "That'll be Rebecca," I said. "She's my patent attorney. Probably more updates." Carlos frowned. "More," I answered, putting it on speaker. "Hi, Rebecca." "Daisy," she said, excitement bleeding through her professional tone. "Samsung just came in with a counteroffer. $6.8 billion for primary rights and an additional research fund that could exceed $10 billion over 5 years. They want to begin negotiations tonight." I looked around the table. My father's eyes were glassy. Mom covered her mouth with both hands. Gabriella's wine glass shook. Carlos's color drained entirely. "Thank you, Rebecca," I said calmly. "Please tell them I'll review the terms tomorrow. I'm in the middle of dinner with my family." Rebecca paused, clearly smiling. "Of course, Dr. Jimenez. Congratulations again, you're making history." When I hung up, I noticed something strange in Carlos's eyes, not envy exactly. Not yet. Something quieter, something closer to fear. "Daisy," he said softly, "I didn't mean all those things I said before, about your work. You know that, right?" I nodded. "Of course you didn't. You just believed them." He swallowed hard. "You're not going to let this change you, right?" I smiled faintly. "Carlos, everything's already changed. You just haven't caught up yet." The words weren't cruel. They were simply true. Mom finally stood up, her voice trembling with a mix of pride and disbelief. "I can't believe it. My daughter. The genius." Dad nodded slowly, his pride returning now that he could measure it in billions. "We should open more wine," Don't I said quietly. "Not yet. This isn't a celebration. It's a revelation." The room went still again, because deep down they all knew what I meant. This wasn't about money or fame. It was about truth. The truth that had been ignored, diminished, or laughed at my entire life. And now that truth had finally become too bright to look away from. Carlos reached for his glass again, but missed, his fingers trembling slightly. "So what happens now? I negotiate. I build. I decide who gets to shape the future. The future, he echoed hollowly. I stood my chair, scraping against the floor. For the record, I said, I'm proud of you, Carlos. Your promotion is still an achievement. I just think it's time you stopped assuming success comes with a dress code. He looked up at me, then really looked. The first genuine look of recognition I'd ever seen from him. And for a fleeting second, I saw something fragile in his expression. Not jealousy, not resentment, regret. It passed quickly hidden beneath the tight smile of a man trying to stay composed. Mom turned to me with tears in her eyes. Daisy, we've been unfair to you. I nodded. I know. You forgive us. I hesitated. I don't know if forgiveness is the right word, but I'm not angry anymore. You didn't believe in me, but I did, and that was enough. Dad finally spoke. You're remarkable, Daisy. I've always been, I said gently. You're just finally seeing it. Another buzz interrupted the silence, this time a text from Rebecca. Tesla, $8.2 billion offer. Wants meeting in the morning. I turned my phone so Carlos could see. He stared at the number, then exhaled a shaky laugh. $8 billion. Seems my wire's finally connected, I said with a small smile. No one laughed this time. The dinner had started as a celebration of Carlos's promotion. It ended in quiet awe, the sound of reality rearranging itself around a new center of gravity. When I finally stood to leave, Mom hugged me tighter than she ever had. We're so proud of you, she whispered. I hugged her back, but the warmth felt distant, because I knew something she didn't. Their pride was real, but it was conditional. They didn't suddenly understand me. They just understood the number. And that number had become my language, the only one they could finally hear. In the days that followed, my phone became a portal to an entirely different universe. Emails from Silicon Valley executives, calls from energy conglomerates, invitations to conferences I hadn't even applied to. Words like exclusive partnership equity clause and research endowment and flooded my inbox faster than I could breathe. The technology world had erupted overnight. News headlines read things like, Stanford scientist achieves the impossible room temperature, superconductivity confirmed. The woman who just rewired the future. For the first time, people couldn't stop talking about me. And yet the only voices I wanted to hear sounded different now, small, familiar, hesitant. My parents called every morning. Not every few weeks, not just on birthdays, every single morning. Did you eat? Are you sleeping? Have you signed any deals yet? At first, it was endearing. Then it started feeling like an audit. Dad began sending me articles about wealth management for innovators. Mom kept dropping names of distant cousins who'd love to help if you ever start a company. They weren't trying to be malicious. They were just interested now. But interest isn't the same as understanding. Carlos called too, more than he ever had. Hey sis, he'd say, voice full of a strange cheeriness. Just wanted to check in. Crazy times, huh? Very. I'd reply, keeping my tone neutral. So, what's next? Are you going to sell it? Build your own company. I know people who could. I already have a legal team. I'd interrupt gently. But thank you. Right, of course. Just proud of you. You know I know Carlos. We hung up, and for the first time in our lives, it was him trying to earn my approval. Funny how quickly gravity shifts when the orbit changes. Still, I didn't hate him for it. I didn't hate any of them. I just watched with quiet fascination as their tones softened, their words grew sweeter, their pride bloomed, only after money made me visible. I'd waited my whole life to be heard. Now I couldn't stop being listened to. But not all attention feels like love. Some of it feels like debt. Rebecca met me at a small cafe one evening, sliding her tablet across the table. Tesla raised to $9.1 billion. Apple's countering with 9.8, plus a position leading their new research division. Google's offering equity and full independence. I exhaled. It's too much. That's what happens when you create something priceless, she said, sipping her coffee. But I have to ask, how are you holding up? I smiled faintly. Everyone suddenly loves me. Rebecca tilted her head. Do they love you, or what you did? I looked away. Does it matter? It should, she said softly. You've got power now, Daisy. Don't let affection, disguised as opportunity, guide you. I thought about that all night. The next morning, Mom called again. Sweetheart, have you thought about involving Carlos somehow, as your business liaison? He's so good with people. I froze. You mean the same Carlos who told me to get a real job? Her voice trembled slightly. He didn't mean that. He was young. He was 31. Mom. Well, he's changed. He's been feeling left out lately. I bet he has, I said quietly. That afternoon, Carlos showed up at my office unannounced. He stood in the doorway awkwardly holding 2 coffees. Truce, he asked. I gestured for him to sit. You didn't have to come all the way here. He shrugged. You weren't answering my texts. I've been busy. He nodded, then looked around at the lab machines humming softly, papers stacked in organized chaos. You built all this. I mean, this is your world. It's always been my world, I said gently. You're just seeing it for the first time. He swallowed hard. I know I wasn't the best brother. I said things I shouldn't have. I waited. I thought I was helping, he continued, pushing you to be practical. You were pushing me to be you, I corrected. And when I didn't fit your mold, you decided I was wrong. He nodded, shame flickering across his face. I was jealous, he admitted quietly. Not now, back then. You had purpose. I just had noise. I think I made fun of you because I couldn't understand you. His honesty startled me. For a moment, I saw not the confident golden boy, but a man struggling to reconcile who he'd been with, who he was becoming. I appreciate you saying that, I said finally. Truly. He smiled weakly. You really forgive me. I looked at him for a long time. I never hated you, Carlos, but I stopped needing you to see me. That's not something forgiveness fixes. He nodded slowly. Still proud of you, though. I know. After he left, the quiet of the lab felt different, less lonely, more deliberate. Rebecca called again that evening. Final offers are in, she said. We can accept one or license to multiple. Each path has its pros and cons. Tell me, selling outright one company controls the technology, and you walk away richer than most nations. Licensing, everyone gets a piece, but you stay in charge. In charge, I repeated. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every scene from my past. The laughter, the dismissals, the nights I spent working under flickering lights while my family celebrated Carlos's promotions. Power had never interested me before, but now I understood its purpose. Control wasn't about dominance, it was about freedom. The freedom to never be silenced again. The next morning I called Rebecca. License it, I said, to all of them. She paused. You're sure? Yes. If this technology belongs to everyone, no one can cage it or me. There was pride in her voice when she replied, That's the right choice, Daisy. Not the richest, but the most powerful. When the deals were finalized, the numbers made global headlines $18.7 billion across multiple industries. Reporters camped outside the institute. Investors called nonstop. My inbox became a battlefield. And my parents. They were suddenly the proudest people in the city. Mom posted old photos of me holding science fair ribbons. Dad bragged to his golf buddies. Carlos introduced me to people as my sister, the genius. I smiled, played along, but inside I felt nothing. Because deep down I knew they didn't love me more than before. They just finally understood what I was worth in a language they could translate. And that was their tragedy, not mine. It took months for the noise to fade. The headlines, the interviews, the conference invitations, they all came in waves, and I let them wash over me until I learned how to breathe beneath them. The money didn't change me as much as people expected. I didn't buy a mansion or a sports car. I bought time, the most valuable thing I'd been denied my entire life. Time to build time, to teach time to think. The first thing I did was create the Jimenez Foundation for Material Science, a program that offered research grants to students whose ideas were too abstract or too ambitious for traditional funding. Kids who reminded me of myself, misfits with spark in their eyes, and no one to see it. When I signed the founding documents, Rebecca said quietly, This will help generations of dreamers, Daisy. I smiled. Then it's worth more than all the bids combined. It wasn't philanthropy, it was reclamation. The girl who once took apart radios just to see how they worked had finally built something that connected not wires, but people. And yet, some nights I still felt the same silence humming in my chest. Success doesn't erase old wounds, it just changes their echo. My parents visited often now. Mom always brought food, pretending she was just checking in. Dad would wander the lab halls like a tourist, running his fingers over equipment he didn't understand. He'd chuckle. I still don't know how half of this works, but I'm glad you do. I'd smile. You don't need to, Dad. We never spoke of the years in between the dinners, the dismissals, the jokes. Some truths don't need retelling once they've been paid for in silence. Carlos changed too. He stopped bragging so loudly, started listening more. He'd call just to talk about normal things. Mom's new garden, Gabriella's pregnancy, the quiet panic of getting older. Once he showed up at my foundation's opening gala wearing a plain suit and nervous smile. I didn't want to make it about me this time, he said awkwardly. I laughed. That's growth, Carlos. He handed me a letter. This is from me, for the foundation. It's not much compared to what you have, but I cut him off with a hug. It's not about the amount, it's about the effort. Thank you. He pulled back his voice soft. You know, I used to think success meant being seen by everyone. Now I think it's just about being understood by someone. I smiled faintly. You're catching up. The moment was small, but it was everything. For the first time, I didn't see my brother as a rival or a reminder, just a man trying to rebuild a bridge he'd once burned without knowing it. Mom later told me he'd started telling people my sister taught me that silence can be louder than applause. I didn't correct her. I just let the words sit because maybe finally they'd started listening. Still, I never forgot what silence had cost me. Every time I mentored a young researcher who doubted themselves, I told them, don't waste energy convincing people who can't see you. Build something so bright they can't ignore you. That became my quiet mantra. My legacy wasn't the money or the patent or even the technology. It was the freedom to define worth on my own terms. One night, months later, I returned to my old family home for dinner. Same table, same clock ticking in the hallway. But everything felt lighter, now less charged. Carlos passed me the wine, grinning. Careful, genius, don't short-circuit the glass. I smirked. I'll risk it. Mom laughed. Dad clinked his glass, and for a fleeting second it almost felt like peace. Then Carlos asked, do you ever miss it? The chase. I thought about it, the hunger, the long nights, the silence that used to haunt me like static. Sometimes I admitted, but I don't miss needing to prove myself. He nodded slowly. Guess you finally got the last word, huh? I shook my head. No, Carlos. I just changed the language. Outside, the evening light softened against the windows, gold spilling across the walls like something divine. As I stood to leave, I looked back at them, my imperfect, conditional, deeply human family, and felt a quiet gratitude that surprised me. They hadn't changed overnight. But maybe they didn't have to. Maybe it was enough that they finally saw me as I'd always been. At the door, Mom hugged me tightly and whispered, you were never just playing scientist. I smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. I know, Mom. Then, with a calmness that only time and truth can bring, I added, but sometimes the ones who play are the ones who change the world. And for the first time in my life, the silence that followed didn't hurt. It was peace.